starting. Welcome to A Machine Dreams of African Print. I'm Ludmila Rodrigues. I was invited by Stroom Den Haag to host the Nest Collective within the program Our House, Your Home. For those who are not in the Netherlands, Stroom Den Haag is a platform for visual arts, stimulating the art climate in The Hague and elsewhere. Our House, Your Home is an experimental program of exchange based on hospitality, inviting international organizations in a mutual learning process, sharing ideas and practices. The Nest Collective is a multidisciplinary group from Nairobi, Kenya, working in film, music, fashion, visual arts, literature, and other media, exploring Kenyan identities. The Nest Collective is the fourth guest of Our House, Your Home. Due to the pandemic, we have collaborated remotely, experimenting with an online hybrid co-learning format. Three members of the collective, Jim Chuchu, Sunny Dolat, and Njoki Ngumi, have been working with Stroom since September 2020, researching textiles as a medium to unpack issues of belonging, identity, and culture and design. Through the project Material Languages, they have produced experiments reflecting on what roles contemporary African textiles play in the arenas of ritual, collective healing, and archive. Within Material Languages, artist, filmmaker, and co-founder of the Nest Collective, Jim Chuchu, has developed a series of patterns using a contemporary computer-based process, which he'll be presenting tonight. You're welcome to post your questions. We'll be moderating them on the chat and ask Jim after his talk. Last, we want to thank the support of Prince Claus Funds for Culture and Development, the Mondrian Funds, and the City of The Hague for the program Our House, Your Home. Thank you all for being present here tonight. Please, let's welcome Jim.
Hi, everyone. It's really strange to be speaking to people you can't see, but I'm gonna do this. So my name is Jim Chuchu. I'm a member of the Nest Collective. And like Ludmila said, we've been working with Stroom for the past slightly more than a year to make this project happen. My project is one of three projects that we explored together with my colleagues, Sunny and Njoki from the collective. I'll be sharing the process and the logic for the works that I've done. And I'll also be sharing kind of links as I talk, just so that if you're interested in going deeper into any of these things, you can find your way. For those who don't know the collective, we've been operating since 2012. Our strengths have always been within digital medium, like film and photography and music and fashion. We've published books, we've made films. And so at the start of the pandemic in 2020, the thought that we had as a collective was that, that the world was changing and that artistic practice had to change as well. And so our thoughts as a collective were, how do we emerge, if ever, from this pandemic? What is our responsibility as artists? What is our responsibility as a collective to kind of change as the world changes? This program with Stroom was initially designed as a kind of residency and was supposed to travel, but then traveling became impossible. And so in a sense, this project that I'm presenting could not have happened if we had traveled, because many of the thoughts that I had that led into this process happened because we were talking online via Zoom. And I think, Ludmila, I have to thank you, because there's one thing you said while we were talking about how there's an interesting group in the Netherlands who are thinking through machine-assisted design. So one of the thoughts here is about how emerging technologies move in this world. We live in a world where technology moves from the global north to the global south, unless of course it's a military technology, which is going to be deployed in the global south. These things tend to happen in the global north and then drift slowly down to the global south where we exist. So the first time that we really confronted this as a collective was in 2017 when we came across virtual reality. This was a project called Let This Be a Warning. I've just pasted a link. But Let This Be a Warning was a virtual reality short film that we created as a collective. It was our first time working with virtual reality. And in 2017, virtual reality was in a very, very raw place. Shooting was a nightmare. The cameras would overheat. You'd have to stop shooting to let the cameras cool down. The softwares were really, really raw and really kind of scary to work with. But for us as a collective, that was an interesting experiment because we felt like we were on the bleeding edge of technology. And that was new for us because, like I said, by the time technology reaches Kenya or Africa or the global south, it's usually ready for the market in a sense. It has been tested by global north markets. And by the time it reaches us, it's kind of like, it's not in beta anymore. It's ready to be used. So that was an interesting process for us because it was really quite rough. And some of the things we learned, we actually were teaching our fellow partners in South Africa and the UK, who were also kind of helping to figure out how to make this virtual reality thing work. So that was really interesting. These issues have not gone away and they continue to affect us with the ways that technology is dispersed. And so when Ludmila mentioned machine-assisted design, I thought, hey, maybe this is another chance to revisit this kind of space where I could learn how to figure this out. So in the collective, none of us are trained as artists. Kenya being the kind of country where artistic training isn't necessarily very ingrained in our national curriculums, let alone fine art training at the higher level. And so most of us in the collective, I think our biographies are quite strange. We have actuarial science. We have medical doctors who defected from medicine and come to do these works. We have people who are working in social work, mathematics, and myself, I trained in computer science. And so when I heard about machine-assisted learning, I thought this is something I could probably wrap my head around because this is kind of thing that we used to explore in school. I have mentioned, so artificial intelligence is an interesting place because I've been reading a lot about how those same issues that I've just mentioned about how global north designed technologies don't necessarily fit very well in the global south. And we're seeing that happening with regard to things like predictive policing. We've been reading about how some countries, some states in the US have been deploying predictive policing, which is these algorithms that predict where a crime will happen and who will do it, which sounds like a nightmare straight from that film, Minority Report. And the stories that are coming out of that have been difficult because sometimes the algorithms become unnecessarily punitive. And it's very important that we unpack these phenomena. We've also heard about racial bias in healthcare algorithms. I've just listed a link there. And these things build on a history of such kind of scientific racism. When you think about older stories about how it took a long time for the medical community to start to learn that when Black women say they're feeling pain, it is real, because a lot of the culture in medical science was to tell them that it's a psychosomatic thing. You're not feeling that much pain. We're not going to give you painkillers. And I think, again, also about things like film stocks, for instance, which were built for white skin. And so what did color film, for instance, do for the Black skin? It took a long time for imaging industries to think that through and kind of look at how digital cameras, were they using the same kind of biases in how they record light. I'm also remembering the story about the AI chatbot that went out on Twitter and within hours had become a Nazi kind of misogynist demon, because that's what it was learning from all the trolls that were enjoying having fun with that. So I think that is the kind of thought that I went into this process, feeling like I needed to unpack. So let me just start sharing some of the images. So machine learning, I'll give you a short brief for those people who maybe haven't really kind of thought that through. Machine learning is a set of technologies that allow computers to learn without being programmed, which is cool when you think about it, because then for a process like this that I was doing, I didn't have to code every single step of this process. A lot of this happened automatically. And one of the things that makes this possible is this thing called neural networks. And neural networks, I'll just say briefly, are algorithms that mimic the human brain. They mimic the way that we learn. They mimic the way that we absorb information. I'm going to post some links just to explain that a little bit more. So if you've read the description for this event, there was something called generative adversarial networks, or GANs, which are what I used particularly for this process. It sounds terrible, and this explanation here is the simplest one I could find online. But maybe a better way to explain it would be this way, where you have two neural networks that are playing a game in a sense. One neural network is this one called the generator, and the other one is this one called the discriminator. So the generator tries to mimic these real world images, create a bank of images, and the generator then plays a game with the discriminator. The discriminator picks a sample from your real world images, picks a sample from the generator, and it tries to see which one is real, which one has been generated. And it does that over and over again. And with time, the generator is trying to fool the discriminator. The discriminator is very happy. The generator is very happy when it fools the discriminator and makes the discriminator think that the image I've provided from you is a real one. So when you do this many times, the generator gets to a place where it is so good at tricking the discriminator that the images it is producing look very much like the sample images that you provided. That's the simplest way I can explain this. And so in terms of process, what this means is that if you build a very large bank of images or text or whatever you're trying to recreate, and the numbers can be, if you're looking at photographs, for instance, you're thinking about maybe 3,000 images, 4,000 images, 10,000, if you can find 10,000 images. And then you put those into the model, and then the generator starts trying to mimic them. The more images you provide, the more data the generator has to create these new samples. So my idea then was to find many images of African prints, African motifs, and supply these to the model and see what comes out at the other end. And I started to do this by coding using Python, which is the language that one language that is very useful in building these GANs. And then I came across this tool called Runway. Runway, they call it a next generation creative toolkit. I'm going to paste a link here. Runway is interesting because it takes all these machine learning kind of technologies and presents them in a way that can be useful for creative projects. So there's some interesting models there that are generating poetry, that are allowing people to do all this cool green screen stuff, that are, I think if you've seen videos online of old photographs kind of moving around in video or speaking. This is the same technology that is being used to do that. It's always funny that new technologies quickly become tools for making memes, but such is the world. So using Runway, it became much more easier for me to manage this process. And speaking to this thing that I've just mentioned about how the world is designed in a way that the global north kind of designs for itself and then the global south kind of plugs in. This is one of the first steps when you're getting into Runway. When you're building a model, these 4 options here for faces, objects, scenes, and illustrations, those are the defaults. And already you can see here that these defaults are not necessarily defaults that you could call global in their design, which means that, for instance, if I was trying to create a model that generates faces, how easy is it for me to use black faces? And does the model begin from a white face as its default? Does the model start from an illustration that is kind of coming from this art history that is very global north-sided? So these are the ways in which sometimes you work with a tool that is ideally supposed to be global, but the foundations of it are very, very specific to one society. Having said that, because I was creating motifs and patterns that are not necessarily human, I suppose that in a way I kind of evaded some of these issues. So motifs that I provided into this image bank, I created a bank of about 1,000 images. This is actually the most boring part of the process because you just have to download and look for images that kind of fit what you're trying to contextualize. And I can tell you it's very difficult to find 1,000 images of African print. So using a mixture of taking photographs in textile shops, downloading images from all kinds of sources, Instagram and Tumblr and all those, I finally got together these 1,000 images and then supplied them to the model. Here's some other examples of like motifs that I put into the model. I guess here, one of the first questions becomes, what does an African motif look like? What does an African pattern look like? Some of them are arguably easy to point out and say, this is a very African looking print. But the line is quite thin around the edges, because if you think about someone like Picasso and the whole Cubist movement, there was kind of a smearing of that line. And these kind of African aesthetics became quite global when presented by this white artist. So many things that you can think through there about what exactly does an African print look like? What exactly does an African motif look like? Results from the model, like I said, these generative models take each time that the model plays, each time that the generator tries to trick the discriminator, you call that a step. And so the more steps you run, the better the model gets. So these are kind of the samples, the outputs that you get. Around 3,000 steps, this is what it was looking like, which is quite hellish. If you have like that phobia for like holes and things, this is probably quite hellish for you. And of course, this looks nothing like an African print. But when you continue running the steps at 10,000 steps, it starts to look a lot clearer and a lot more like something you'd call an African print. This was very interesting for me because if you know my aesthetic, I'm not a person who enjoys using very, very bright colors. So this was interesting. My works generally tend to be very monochromatic. So it was interesting to see this model kind of spit back these vivid reds and blues and oranges. And there's a lot to be said here about, do we really understand what happens inside these neural networks? Are we able to explain how it chooses what colors come to the front, what motifs come to the top. There's a little bit of magic there, and I guess we'll talk later on about authorship with regard to these processes. So I got all these images out of the model, and now the question became curation, choosing the images that I felt looked a lot like African print or looked very interesting. And so I guess here are some samples of like images that I started to pull out from the bank and say there's something interesting happening here. My colleague Sunny Dollart was very critical here because I showed him some of these, and Sunny is like our in-house fashion textile expert. So it was really cool to hear his feedback about these. It was really particularly interesting to hear him say that some of these images reminded him of like batik and all these other very handcrafted processes. And I guess it's a kind of, depending on how averse you are to machines or how much you've been watching Terminator, it's kind of cool, but also kind of creepy that you can get something that looks so handmade from a process that is completely led by machines. So with the help of my colleagues at the Nest, I kind of curated these works, and I guess you can even see some of these that have ended up becoming some of the prints. And so then the process then became converting these into textures that can be printed digitally. And for that, I came across this really cool tool called Repper. I'm going to post a link here. Repper is cool because it allows you to create geometric patterns, seamless patterns, all kinds of cool patterns. If you're a designer and you're here, if you're an artist, this would be cool to explore. I can see questions and I'm going to address them later on. So Repper is cool because it allows you to really look at how your little image would look like when expanded multiple times. Again, this was very, it was cool to have Sunny's help on this, telling me, kind of guiding me not to make it too mathematical and keep it organic. And I think you can see some of the screenshots from the interface here. And so in the end, these are the kind of patterns that I eventually felt like, okay, this is cool. And like, if you print these out and hang them in a market, no, you wouldn't necessarily think machine learning or AI looking at them. And yeah, that was an interesting exploration. So then we chose a couple of them to go to print. And again, here, thanks to Ludmila and the Stroom team, we came across these cool guys called House of You, who print, they do sustainable fashion. I'm gonna paste the link in the chat. And again, here, you confront this question of how does technology disseminate in the world. Climate change and sustainable futures are a problem for the whole world, but you find that it's very difficult to find these technologies here in Kenya, which is a bit strange because we are not somehow separate from the rest of the world. We do suffer from those issues of waste and climate change. There's like, for instance, there's this crazy like garbage dump in Kenya, in Nairobi, particularly in Dandora, an area of Nairobi called Dandora. And we have this huge kind of post-apocalyptic dump site thing, which kind of just tells you that Nairobi hasn't really dealt with its waste issues. And maybe many countries haven't dealt with their waste issues. So yeah, can you print sustainable textiles in Kenya? I don't think so. Maybe Sunny will be talking about that in 3 weeks' time. But anyway, House of You are cool because they allowed us to print on all these cool fabrics they call circular fabrics. for instance, we printed on, they call it circular chiffon, circular silk, Ecovero chalice. So these, they're called circular because they're made from a base of recycled polyester. Or rather, this recycled polyester comes from recycling PET bottles, those beverage and soda bottles that we always chucking into the waste. Ecovero chalice is made from sustainable wood and pulp. So, but it has this kind of like very interesting like sheen that you wouldn't associate with wood. So we printed those, and I think Stroom are hanging those textiles in the facility. I haven't got to see them yet or touch them, but I'm looking forward to that. So, and again, I think Sunny will be talking in about 2 weeks' time, if I'm not wrong. And one of the interesting things to learn was that printing a textile in Kenya is much more costly than printing a textile in Turkey and shipping it to Nairobi, which just tells you how, and a lot of people would think that then the Kenyan textile manufacturers are being unfair, but the truth is that the cost of electricity is crazy here. The taxes are crazy in Kenya. And so you find that it is cheaper to print, ship a textile all the way from Turkey than to print it here in Nairobi, which is kind of sad, because it would be great to have this complete kind of manufacturing narrative where you design and produce and print the whole thing where you live. And that's a thing that we will take quite seriously with this project, because we don't want to kind of have this very local design thought and then kind of break it apart by involving all these planes and things in making the textiles available. So if you're interested in the questions of costing and the question of sustainability, please attend Sunny's talk, which will happen in 2 weeks' time, because Sunny is amazing in the way that he thinks through fast fashion and all those things. So the 4 prints that we decided to go with, I called them Athi, Bahati, Subra, and Tana, which are the 4 prints that I chose. We call this a machine dreams of print, of African print. And thanks to House of You, this is some kind of renders of what the fabrics look like. I think Ludmila probably has some video of like actually touching them and unpacking them, which is a cool thing to see. Open questions that remain for me are things like authorship was definitely a question that we battled with. Who designed these fabrics? I talked about this with the collective members, and because so much of what happens inside these neural networks is very difficult to unpack, and I'm going to post a link about that, what they call these black box issues. And the only answer I have to that question of authorship right now is that it is me who decided to frame this image bank, and my aesthetic choices around framing the image bank kind of is an authorship. And of course, the curation of the results and choosing what kind of struck me is another step, which would also be called authorship. And then, of course, finishing these patterns and making them seamless and the whole Photoshop and sending them to print then becomes also an act of authorship. But it is an interesting question, particularly because I'm seeing a lot of AI models that are now writing poetry and starting to write literature. And I guess we are heading towards this very brave future where it will be very difficult to distinguish between machine creativity and human creativity. And there's something interesting there to explore in terms of like, what does make us human beings? If machines can start to make art, are we kind of losing one more thing that distinguishes us from the rest of life, from the rest of the universe? Other open questions that I found interesting were this issue of black box neural networks. So black box neural networks is this idea that you put input into this neural network and you get output. But there's been a question about people not really understanding how the AI creates those outputs, what rules or what lessons it learned. And I find that interesting because it reminds me of like all those, it reminds me of things like Jurassic Park, where you watch this movie and like there's all this excitement about science and technology, but like you can hear that there's something there that doesn't sound right in terms of like, why would you want to recreate a very vicious carnivore? There's a way that human beings kind of dive into science in a way that sometimes is self-destructive, which I find interesting. And that can be said about many things, including I read a disgusting story about these chimeras that the scientists are now building, which are these hybrids between pigs and human beings. And they're using them to kind of harvest stem cells and organs because the thought is that they don't have a human soul. I find that very problematic because the assumption there is that animals don't have souls, or that they are not like full living things that have dignity. And so sometimes I listen to scientists and I wonder about where we're headed. And I guess one last thing that I'm still curious about, and maybe we can talk about in the Q&A, is about fair image use. When building image banks and you download all these images or texts from all over the place online, in my mind, I know that it is kind of like taking my model to an art museum so that it can see, which is pretty much how artists operate. Like you go, you read books, you listen to music, and you are inspired, and then you create new works. I think most artists would say that it's rare to have a completely original thought. And I think that applies to these neural networks as well. You have to supply old thoughts in a sense for them to be able to generate new thoughts. But I did wonder about creating this image bank of thousands of images, but I don't own those images. And yet here I am, and I can own the output of this AI, but I have used the skill and the talent of other artists who made those old works. So I feel that's a bit of an open question for me in terms of like what is inspiration and what is theft and what is appropriation. I do know that the images that came out of this model was so different from what I put in, and I have tried to kind of compare, to kind of create a direct correlation between an image that went in and the image that came out, and I can't find anything in the image bank that looks like what came out. So that's been reassuring, but also super interesting and kind of creepy. So I think that's all I have to say. I want to leave room for people to ask questions, and I hope this made sense. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jim. And thank you for sharing the links immediately. That was really dynamic. And we have quite some questions already here. So yeah, thanks, Michelle, for helping out. So let's go for them. Yeah. Michaela Lakova says, quite interesting, thank you. I'm still not sure how from feeding images to the machine, it became that, the images you show. Yeah, I'm not sure if she came from the beginning or if she, yeah. Well.
Okay, how you feed the images in. So that's, I guess I could show you the interface for Runway. It's kind of intuitive in that you upload your images, and let me just open up the interface. And as I do that, maybe someone else can ask another question. So here we go. This is the interface for Runway. And if you want to create a new model, you come here to train and you choose, in my instance, I was choosing the image because I'm generating an image. And the first question that it asks you is to select a data set, right? And that's where you'd kind of upload your huge folder full of images. And then, yeah, and then kind of choose what training, what pre-trained model you want to use as your basis for the next steps. Because I was using patterns, I went with illustrations because I felt like faces would be too much of a stretch. Turning faces into patterns would mean that we'd have to kind of lose the whole facial structure, the eyes, until we get to a place where the model is now creating patterns. I suppose if you are doing faces, if you are doing objects, these are quite cool, but I went with illustrations. But yeah, in terms of loading the images, that's how it's quite simple. And it's been getting simpler with time as they improve the interface. I hope that explains.
Yeah, thank you. We have some other questions. I also have one that I wanted to add. So if I may, when you say not an African print, some of the images that generated were not really what we would consider, whatever that means, an African print. I wonder if you thought how you felt about it, if your perception of what an African print changed, or if you felt like you were reinventing it, and that must have opened up a lot of thoughts for you.
Absolutely. I think maybe the issue here is the word African. The frame African in itself is a very complex but also reductive frame, because how do you collapse the aesthetics and the cultures of all these countries, all these cultures, and then call that African? It's such a wide frame, and then the borders of that frame are not solid, right? There's influences, there's Arabic influences, there's Indian influences, there's all these influences depending on who was visiting these cultures. So I suppose the problem here is the word African for me. I struggle a lot using the word African, even though sometimes it's politically expedient, or sometimes it's a way of organizing a thought around this continent. But this continent is a difficult thing to frame things around, and it rarely works as a frame.
Yeah.
I suppose maybe another kind of a parallel question would be, would anyone ever be asked to do a European print, right?
Uh-huh.
That would be a very difficult task for a French artist to do a European print. It's like, what does that mean? Do I have to incorporate Albania? Do I have to incorporate all these people? But Africans are routinely asked to represent an entire continent in their work and in their aesthetics, which is often difficult.
Very difficult. Yeah, indeed. Thank you. Let's go to some other questions. When it comes to art, Abdi Latif asked, when it comes to art and invention, the work of Black people and Africans has been stolen, pillaged, and misappropriated. How are you thinking of protecting these designs? Is patenting something you're thinking of?
Ooh. I personally, as Jim, I've always thought that copyright is a kind of ineffective way to. I understand that that's the way the world works, and that is the way that the world has decided that we can protect creativity. I do find it quite porous. I do find it quite restrictive, and let me explain why. I think one of and any artist in this room can attest to the fact that products by Adobe, for instance, are critical when you're working in visual arts. If you're doing print design, if you're publishing, if you're like there's software that you can't operate without using those industry standards. Adobe doesn't sell its products in Africa. I think it's only this year that they started allowing this Creative Cloud thing to be accessible in Kenya. I think you had to buy it in South Africa, some ridiculous thing. But like the question for me then becomes, every music video, every magazine, every book that has ever been published in Africa, ever since people started using computers, what software have we been using if all these industry standard software developers don't see us as a market? And so, of course, when I was a young artist, my first Photoshop was pirated, and my second, and my third, and my fourth. Like there was no way to get a legal copy of Photoshop, and yet Photoshop is the software that I use almost every day in my practice. So that's an example where the legality around access to proprietary things becomes a blockade around creativity. And I think that has really influenced my ideas about how do we free creativity, and how do we value creativity. So Abdi, will I patent these? These ones are a particularly tricky one for me because I'm not yet sure, particularly with regard to the question I just asked about fair use of images. Can I truly copyright and patent these prints? Or am I patenting and protecting the process and the logic and the thoughts rather than the actual prints? It's kind of an open question for me. But generally, I do find copyright to not really be reflective of the world that we live in right now.
Yeah, thank you. We have one more from Abdi Latif again. During the pandemic, the ban of secondhand clothes in Kenya, and before that in countries like Rwanda, has opened a conversation around reviving local textile industries. Mm-hmm. Are you thinking of commercializing these new designs and selling them? Are you thinking of bringing them into the local, regional, and global markets?
So a part of this project, and Sunny will also talk about this, has been making these prints available to Kenyans to buy. I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, we made one of the first prints available in a couple of textile shops, and we were shocked that they sold out in 4 hours. And that for us was surprising because, like I said earlier, textiles are not our medium. This project, we called it Material Languages because it was our entry into a completely different medium. And the thought for us was that it is possible in every medium that we move to, we find the same issues of politics and identity. But it was very interesting to see that Kenyans consume textiles. And that's been interesting to learn because Kenya is also that country where we get tons and tons and tons of secondhand clothes coming in from the States and from Europe. And that has decimated our design and textile and fashion industries because you can't compete with secondhand clothes. People can sell a pair of jeans for 200 Kenyan shillings. And it's with our price of electricity, price of textiles, price of water, all these things, like it's absolutely impossible to compete with that. And that's one of the main reasons why our textile and fashion industries have really suffered. So it was interesting then to put this textile into a shop and have it sell out in 4 hours. And that those textile shops are saying they're getting pre-orders based on these kind of posts that we're doing about these new textiles. It's a very new thing for us. And yes, we're absolutely interested in making them available for sale because in a sense they were designed, particularly with Sunny's prints, which he'll be talking about in 2 weeks, they were designed for Kenyans. Yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. Anne-Elaine, wonderful to see both the process and the result. I wonder if you see a link to the kind of images that you use as input and the use of the final result. For instance, would you select different images of the AI if the textile will be used for clothes, decoration, etc.?
So because before running this model for the fabrics, I tested it out on faces, I tested it out in all kinds of other things I was interested in. And I learned how to help the machine see what I'm trying to make it see. Because the thing about machines is that they don't see like human beings do. When they look at a photograph, they see rows and rows of pixels with data. And for them, it's rows and rows of data. It's not an eye, it's not a body, it's not a smile. And so I think that the art of machine learning imagery is that you have to craft your image bank very carefully, so that you kind of influence the model to give you something that's like what you're trying to get. I think that's one layer that I would call authorship. And so, yes, it's quite possible to kind of shape the output by really, really being very discriminative with the input.
Yeah, in the same line, I wanted to ask how difficult it was to choose those 4 patterns for your first print bag.
Very difficult, because I think the prints that I thought were lovely were almost 16, but we could only afford to print 4. And I think we're also testing the whole process of like printing digitally. It's a new thing for us. So we picked these 4 that I felt were kind of representative of the breadth of the output. But I'd definitely love to print more.
Great. Yeah, let's see. Anthony Moisillo, he asked, given that the source and nature of the data is one of the most important things about material languages and AI, machine learning, I'm sorry, machine learning and AI, should we then work towards building data sources that reflect us as Black people? If so, how do we do it? How do we begin to build these cultural archives that can seem very vast?
Oof, hello, Anthony. So yes to everything you're saying. I think the thing that we're talking about here is how do we decolonialize technology? How do we decolonialize creative technology? I've had this question many times before with regard to, for instance, stock imagery. We have all these websites that are dedicated to stock photography, right? But when you go to like Getty Images or all these places and you search for Black, you get the color Black. You don't get a Black person. When you go to Google image search and you search for Black makeup, I assure you, you're not gonna get like a Black face. You're gonna get white people wearing Black, like that's how the world works. And I think it's only in the past couple of years that these software companies have started to think through programming such that when you type Black, it offers you the option. Are you searching for African American? Are you searching for African? But that's a new thing. And it came after a lot of protest when people said that when you search for Africa, for instance, on Google Image, you get images of poverty, disease, and war. Or if you're lucky, you get images of animals and tourism. And is that Africa? So in terms of building archives, yes. In terms of algorithms, yes, we must build data banks, not just of images, but also of patient data for Black people. Look at the Genome Project. There's some controversy there about who were they sequencing. Did they sequence Black people? Did they sequence Indigenous people? How do you build a human genome project and you only center your data banks on the global north? Then you're not capturing the entire diversity of the human genome. So it's not just in imagery or in culture. This issue of building archives that are representative of the whole world affects very, very many places. Everywhere where human beings interact with data, that question is there.
Jonathan Rose wrote, can you talk a bit more about the images you sourced? Also thinking about the creation of African from such diverse cultural practices throughout Africa. Where did the images come from? Were they already in the public domain?
Absolutely. I think I've just talked about this earlier in terms of fair image use. is it fair to download images of like all these textile archives, photographs of people, and like the sources? Because when you're trying to build a data of like 1,000 images, you find yourself in the strangest places on the internet. You find yourself on Tumblr. You find yourself in people's personal blogs, trying to find photos. And so the question for me, how I rationalized it was that, and I've mentioned this before, my model needs to see African print in order to be able to understand what I'm trying to do. And for it to see African print, I have to bring African print to it, right? In the same way that if I was an artist who wanted to start painting in a particular style, I'd have to see that style. I'd have to look at other artists who are doing that style. I have to visit museums and whatever. So I thought of it more as bringing data to the model rather than kind of harvesting people's work. But yeah, there's definitely some strong questions there. And the same question has been facing the people who've been building this AI model that is now starting to write Shakespeare and all these things. The question becomes, do you have permissions? And where do you get images in the public domain, especially images for a very particular aesthetic like African? Am I averaging pattern designs across the continent? Yes, I did try to sample as much as possible from different regions, so then I didn't skew it in one way. And if you look for African motifs online and in books, you'll find that there's a heavy skew towards West Africa because there's such interesting iconography happening in West Africa with the symbols that they are using in their prints. And so if you're not kind of quite careful about where you're getting the images from and what they mean, you do find yourself kind of skewing towards the most pictorial cultures. Kenya, in terms of Kenya's textile history, and that's one of the issues that we are talking about with this project, Kenya's textile history is a patchy one because Kenya's identity issues are quite patchy. If you look at the Maasai, for instance, they are quite known for these red and blue blankets. But when you look at these red and blue blankets, they are kind of like Scottish plaid. They are like tartan, you know. So there's a lot of questions there about like, what makes things African? Is it an association or is it manufacture? Again, if you think about Ankara and all these textiles that are called African print, you find that the people manufacturing them are actually the Dutch and the Chinese. And we've talked about this with the Stroom team about Vlisco, for instance, and how much power they have over the wax print market. So what makes a print African? Is it that Africans like it and use it? Or is it that it came from them? And where does that line end?
Yeah, indeed, it is difficult discussion. We have
questions from Wangari. Maybe this one first.
Okay, one question from Wangari. Hi, Stroom. Yes, wondering where we can see the rest of the designs, in particular Jim's favorite 16.
My favorite 16 we've started with the first 4, which we are trying to get them into the shops within the next couple of weeks or months. And depending on how the sales go, that would allow us to then print the next 4. But the sales from Sunny's prints have been very encouraging. And so I think, yeah, they're coming soon.
Exciting. Yeah, another one from Wangari. You mentioned the patterns that emerged actually ended up looking like old traditional handcrafted prints. Was this the most surprising thing in the process? And were you hoping to create something new, if there is such a thing?
Absolutely. It's very surprising to you know, I have in my life as a visual kind of geek artist person, there have been many processes that have been surprising. I think learning how to use light and photography was always magical for me because the results would surprise me. I'm the kind of person who spends hours in Photoshop because the results always surprise me. And so I think there's I'm the kind of person who, I suppose I'm a kind of a digital native in the sense that I've been able to find the mystery and the magic even in the digital. When I started in photography, a lot of people said that digital photography was clean and antiseptic and that there was no magic in it. But I never had that struggle. I've always, for me, digital has always been more intuitive. And I think I've always been super interested in how do you use the digital to evoke the handmade and the handcrafted, because I do agree it's very possible to kind of find yourself doing very hard lines and very antiseptic things with digital technology. For instance, the obsession with 4K and 8K and 16K are, I think there's a point where film becomes too clear, where you start to see the too much detail. Sometimes you watch TV and you're like, this is like jarringly detailed. And there's kind of aesthetic you get from softer film looks that appeals to me. So getting these soft, very, I couldn't believe what was coming out of the other end, basically, like the gradients and the lines. And I can just kind of zoom into one of them. I found that to be very, very surprising. And I think when we talked to Sunny, he told me that if you don't say that it's generated digitally, people would not, that's not where people would go in their minds. Let me look for one as we continue. Yeah, we can pick up another question as I look for something to zoom into.
Okay. So ask now. All right, there is another interesting question. Did you start generating African pattern models right away, or did you try other data sets first?
Absolutely. While trying to learn how this thing works, I definitely tried other kinds of data sets, and the results were equally interesting. They were not textiles. I think I tried generating. I tried food. I tried biology. I tried botany, and the results were. I think Ludmila has seen some of them. Some of them are quite creepy and nightmarish. But definitely very interesting. So this tool doesn't necessarily only apply to design and of that kind of formal like pattern and design. It applies to all kinds of imagery that you can imagine. If you visit Runway, you'll see some really cool things that people have been making.
Yeah. Cool. We have another one from John Rose. This is so interesting, Jim. Thank you, because he made another question before. I wonder if you have encountered people who come from the traditions that generate these prints. Has anyone from the tradition-bearing population commented at all on this project, on the use of their imagery? Maybe a bigger question, but how do you treat data lineages with care?
Data lineages is a beautiful term. Thank you for that term. I'll be thinking about that for a while after this. Yeah, again, I think that the saving grace for this whole process is that, like I said earlier, when I tried to compare, and it wasn't very difficult because, for instance, if you group them by color, for instance, and say all these red outputs, let me look at the red inputs and see what they look like. And there was absolutely no similarity. And I think one reason for that would be that when using kind of machine learning, the more steps you do, the more closer you get to the input. But in all my experiments, no matter how many steps, and maybe it's because my data sets have not been kind of monolithic and like homogeneous, but even if I go into 20,000 steps, 30,000 steps, the model doesn't reach like equal parity with the input. And so I've never been able to generate the exact kind of image that went into the model. So I think in a way, I can say for now that it looks like it's impossible to get an output that mimics an input. And I suppose that for me kind of makes the data, what do you call it? The data lineage? That there's some safety in that you're not replicating, you are inspiring the model in a sense. But yeah, these are open questions for me in terms of like, what are the ethics of harvesting data and then recontextualizing it? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And another one, do you have one?
No, our guest will be sharing some interesting things.
Okay, yeah, there's some links being shared by Ulrich in the chat that we might also like to see the works of Tunde M. Akinwumi from Nigeria, the African Print, Hoax, and some others, yeah. On another one of Wendy Hui Kyung Chung, Queering Homophily in her critique of AI in, yeah, and then there is a link there. So, yeah, thank you, Ulrich, for sharing.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. Great, sorry?
You can ask if there's anyone.
Yes, I have to see if I had another question, but I think I have, yeah, I have made my, yeah, main ones, yeah. It's a lot, yeah. Really, yeah, really generous that you share this whole process that is like relatively new and still with so many open questions and so rich in, yeah, in so many political issues as well. It seems that we have one more question here right now. Chromatic question. Did you try to use consistent color palettes? Did you try random colors too?
Like I mentioned earlier, and I can share one image. At the beginning, I did want to kind of restrict the model very strongly and just kind of provide it with black and white data. But doing that for 1,000 images was a daunting task. And so with time, I kind of loosened the data. And I think maybe there is something there to be said about how the results then were influenced by this kind of monochromatic block that I put in the beginning, but then it loosened up as I went forward and started to include colors and images that I don't necessarily kind of use in my work, such as these ones I'm sharing now. I think some of these prints that are associated with African print tend to be very vibrant, and those color palettes are quite brave, I think. So if you look at the outputs, the model did tend to go towards the warm kind of color scheme, a lot of reds, a lot of yellows, but there are some surprising blues every now and then, and some surprising monochromatics. But yeah, again, how does the model decide what strikes it? And I know that the parameters that the model is using are not of sight. So I'm not really able to explain how the color scheme ended up becoming quite warm and quite red.
Yeah. Also really nice to see the surprising colors that come out of it. Well, thank you. If we don't have any other questions, yeah, I would like to say thanks everyone for being there until now. And thanks so much, Jim, for sharing your process. And yeah, I can remind everyone that at Stroom we are showing 9 of the textiles that were developed by the Nest. There will also be 4. There are 3 more from developed by Sunny, and then the tapestry project by Njoki will be shown on a screen. So whoever is in the Netherlands can pass by, even though we're not open to the public, you can see from outside. And next week, we have the presentation by Njoki Ngumi on Wednesday, May 26th. She'll be presenting her tapestry project. On June 2nd, the 3rd presentation by Sunny Dolat. He'll be discussing textile heritage and futures. And we hope to see you next Wednesday again. For more information, please look up on the website of stroom.nl or thisisthenest.com. And of course, on our social media. And Stroom also recommends the Analog Echo Festival that's happening this month in The Hague. And this talk will be shared later on the YouTube channel of Stroom. And thanks everyone for being there. Dank jullie wel. And asante. So I'll try waving. Yes, we had an idea actually. I don't know if people are still there. We wanted to open the cameras and let everybody see each other in a big gallery format. And if you want to